Member for Kew.
Thank you very much, Acting Speaker. I rise to speak on the Local Jobs First Amendment Bill 2025, and from the outset, can I thank the Minister's staff and the Department for their willingness to put on a briefing for the Coalition and to follow up on any questions we asked in that bill briefing. Acting Speaker, this bill makes a number of amendments to the Local Jobs First Act. Dating back, this is a program that was established in 2003 and requires contractors on government-funded projects to actively support local businesses, workers, apprentices and trainees. It has two key components, the Victorian Industry Participation Policy and the Major Project Skills Guarantee. The Victorian Industry Participation Policy applies to government projects valued at $1 million or more in regional Victoria or $3 million or more in metropolitan Melbourne for statewide tenders. And it requires companies who are tendering for work to include a local industry development plan and also embeds a 10% weighting in tender evaluations for industry development. The Major Project Skills Guarantee, on the other hand, Acting Speaker, applies to any publicly funded construction project valued at over $20 million and requires contractors to ensure that at least 10% of total labour hours are performed by Victorian registered apprentices, trainees or cadets. In 2018, following on the establishment of this program in 2003, the Office of the Local Jobs First Commissioner was established to oversee and promote compliance with these requirements under the Victorian Industry Participation Policy and the Major Project Skills Guarantee. So essentially we're looking at the policy in terms of making sure that major government projects, both in regional Victoria and here in Metropolitan Project, when they're put out for tender, there is a requirement for local content in terms of the supplies, but of course in terms of sourcing labour as well when it comes to local apprentices, making sure that we are using the skills here in Victoria and particularly where we can engage small and medium-sized businesses that are Victorian-based, Australian-based, and of course the definition does go as far as New Zealand-based, to be part of major government contracts and to give those firms and those businesses an opportunity to not only provide skills but to provide supplies and content for those projects. Acting Speaker, the bill before us today makes further amendments to the Local Jobs First Act aimed at enhancing compliance measures, including through additional enforcement powers for the Commissioner and new civil penalties and other consequences for non-compliance with the scheme. Now, the bill will require suppliers to meet their commitments made in their local industry development plan. Now, those commitments are already required under the existing Act, and what this bill before us today is look at how there can be tougher penalties, if you like, a greater compliance regime applied to the Local Jobs First and Industry policy so that those commitments are taken up by the contractors. It will also bestow new powers on the Local Jobs First Commissioner, including additional investigation and reporting powers, a new power to conduct site inspections, and a role to advise and support contracting parties to resolve non-compliance issues. Finally, the bill establishes two new avenues to penalise suppliers for non-compliance. First, it establishes something called a deprioritisation scheme, which is a process which allows the Commissioner to penalise a company in future tenders for government work if they are deemed to have been non-compliant in previous jobs. So when a project reaches completion, practical completion, the Commissioner may issue a deprioritisation notice to a supplier if the supplier does not submit a completion report within 90 days of practical completion, or the completion report indicates that the supplier did not achieve one or more of its local industry development plan commitments. Secondly, Acting Speaker, it introduces a civil penalty mechanism to enable the Commissioner to apply to a court for a civil penalty order or a fine, in other words. And these are significant fines, up to $20,000 or around $20,000 for an individual and around $100,000 for a corporation. For those suppliers who fail to meet their obligations under the VIPP and the MPSG. And as I said, the bill does take quite a punitive approach in terms of the maximum penalty of 100 penalty units for an individual and 500 penalty units for an organisation, equivalent to approximately $20,000 and $101,000 respectively. Acting Speaker, I will be moving a reasoned amendment to this bill on behalf of the Coalition today. Sorry. Okay. Yeah, I know, I was excited. There was something that was coming. Acting Speaker, I will be moving a reasoned amendment to this bill on behalf of the Coalition because we do have serious concerns about some of the measures contained in this bill. Now, let me state very, very clearly to the House that nobody in this place would argue, I would hope, against the logic of promoting local industry development within government projects. It's appropriate for government-funded projects, wherever possible, to incentivise local job creation and local businesses. And they support our apprentices and trainees with opportunities to learn their trade with on-the-job experience. But this bill is not about whether or not we support the Local Jobs First program, but whether or not we support punitive action being taken against businesses that are not able to meet their industry development targets. As I said, Acting Speaker, it's very important that when we have government-funded projects, and in Victoria we have seen over the past decade major projects, increased spending in terms of public sector infrastructure that are looking to, as much as possible, find opportunities to incentivise local job creation and contract local businesses to be part of the delivery of those major projects. Now, not only is that important on the major projects that we see here in Melbourne, whether that might be major train projects, the Metro Tunnel, major road projects, the North East Link, the Westgate Tunnel, but also in regional Victoria, where we know there are small businesses, medium-sized businesses, often family businesses, that are struggling under immense pressure, and to provide opportunities to be part of government projects that are funded by the taxpayer, provides that job creation. It provides the incentive for people to remain in those regions, to be part of those local communities, and for local businesses to provide supplies, manufacturing opportunities, innovation opportunities, and to really value add to major projects that are funded by the taxpayer here in Victoria. But unfortunately, Acting Speaker, the government has not made the case for change when it comes to the bill before us today. They have not provided the case studies or examples of businesses flouting their non-compliance. They have not made the case that projects are consistently departing from their local content requirements, that local apprentices are being denied work on government sites, that subcontractors are missing out on government work. They have not provided one single example of where the current framework has failed. In fact, in response to questions from the Liberals and Nationals members about data on previous breaches and civil actions against contractors that has led to this so-called policy response before us today, the department advised and the government advised that it's not aware of any breaches or actions in relation to specific Jobs First deliverables. Acting Speaker, the Coalition has consulted with suppliers to government, and I will share their feedback for the benefit of the chamber. But before I do, I want to thank my colleague, the member for Narrabeen, for helping. In his absence, I would like to thank the member for Narrabeen for helping us to consult industry on this bill and really bringing to the table a number of contacts he's made throughout his previous experience in the building industry and in regional Victoria in particular, Because the member for Narrowcan, of course, has his own lived experience as to builder tendering for government work, and I look forward to his contributions on the bill later today. But the feedback we have received from industry has been stark. We've been told that where local requirements are able to be met, they are generally being met across industry. Where they are not being met, it is typically because they are unable to be met, not due to the lack of effort or imagination on the part of the tenderer, but instead of working alongside the industry and taking into account market conditions, this bill introduces a great big stick which it is going to whack businesses, and particularly regional businesses here in Victoria. And I'm particularly concerned to hear feedback about the difficulty many businesses operating in regional areas face when it comes to meeting the requirement that 10% of total labour hours be performed by Victorian registered apprentices, trainees or cadets. I want to be very clear that the Coalition is very supportive of this target, which provides a very important opportunity to make sure our apprentices have the opportunity to get that on-the-job training that they need and deserve to be able to pursue their careers. But what we are concerned about is this government is proposing to penalise businesses that, through no fault of their own, Acting Speaker, are unable to meet that requirement. And I want to make a number of points here, Acting Speaker. First, we've had strong feedback in relation to the limited number of apprentices and trainees and cadets available to work on sites in regional areas. Now, being an apprentice in a regional area is a different kettle of fish than here in Melbourne in metropolitan areas, particularly because of the significant distances involved in travelling between jobs. And we know there are broader issues when it comes to trying to find jobs in regional Victoria when it comes to supply of housing, local infrastructure. All the things that we often take for granted here in Melbourne are not always readily available in regional Victoria, and that has to be taken into account. So what we are seeing is apprentices leaving for metropolitan Melbourne, and in particular the lure of the big build here in Victoria. And speaking of the big build, Acting Speaker, we know that the price of building things in this state is under significant upward pressure. We know that under the Allan Labor government, under the past 10 years of Labor in this state, we have seen nearly $50 billion worth of cost blowouts when it comes to government projects. $50 billion of taxpayer money has gone in waste because this government is unable to manage budgets, unable to manage major projects, and the big build continues to cost the Victorian taxpayer every single day. So when it comes to this bill, we need to be aware that the threshold amounts for projects that are captured by the industry participation policy or the major project skills guarantee are not indexed. And as I said earlier, the VIPP applies to government projects valued at $1 million or more in regional Victoria, or $3 million or more in metropolitan Melbourne or statewide tenders. And the MPSG applies to projects valued at over $20 million. So what that means is that increasingly more and more government projects will be subject to the Local Jobs First Act, and so more companies will be liable for penalties under this bill if it passes this parliament. Now, I want to reiterate that it's not the targets that we are concerned by, Acting Speaker. It's the fact that the government wants to give itself more power to beat up on regional businesses that are already doing it tough. We've been told that the increased compliance costs associated with this bill will disproportionately impact smaller businesses that do not have the capacity of larger contractors to absorb the additional cost. Further, we've been given feedback that the increased regulatory burden will require more staff and administration, favouring large firms while placing extra pressure on small operators who are the backbone of industry. And Acting Speaker, let me just speak to some of the feedback we received. And I refer to the Master Builders Victoria, who states about the Local Jobs First Amendment Bill that the proposed changes are likely, and I quote, to create more burden than benefit for many small and medium builders. And as part of that, they note that it was deeply disappointing and that, and I quote, genuine industry consultation on these reforms has been so limited. Now, they say they received an email from the department referring to a meeting held on the 17th of June 2024 as part of the department's so-called targeted consultation. Now, Acting Speaker, when we asked the government for a list of stakeholders that had been consulted as part of these reforms, because we were told there had been very thorough consultation, that industry had been brought through this journey, that had been able to contribute, provide feedback, and were comfortable with the changes. Unfortunately, not surprisingly, but there was a reason why that couldn't be provided, the list of stakeholders that had been consulted, that it was confidential. So we don't have any visibility as the opposition as to how many businesses, industry associations, unions were consulted as part of the proposed changes before us today. But Master Builders Victoria states that as part of the department's targeted consultations that informed the development of this bill, in our view, one meeting over a year ago does not constitute genuine or adequate industry consultation in relation to reforms of this scale and impact. And feedback from their members highlight the following concerns with this bill. As I said, Acting Speaker, increased compliance costs that will disproportionately impact smaller businesses that do not have the capacity of larger contractors to absorb the additional cost. And in addition to the compliance costs, the increased regulatory burden will require more staff and administration, favouring large firms while placing extra pressure on small operators who are the backbone of our industry. Now, we know on this side of the chamber how tough our small, medium and family builders are doing in this state as a consequence of the policies of those opposite, making it harder and harder for those businesses to continue to operate in this state. Increased labour costs as a result of the inflationary impact of the government's big build and the $50 billion worth of blowouts on those projects. Increased labour costs, and once again, as a consequence of the Labor government's inflationary big build policy. We have seen, Acting Speaker, over the past 3 years, a number of family builders collapse in this state, leaving many aspirational homeowners, first-time home buyers, unable to complete their homes as a consequence of the pressure on the building industry in this state. And so when I look to the master builders for their feedback on the bill before us today, and I come to this the point that they make, we consider it manifestly unfair to impose enforcement and financial penalties on head contractors who are unable to meet the local requirement due to insufficient workforce diversity and availability or product availability for the project. The introduction of enforcement risks severely disadvantaging regional areas where there are simply not enough firms available to meet the requirements. So for that reason, Acting Speaker, we are moving a recent amendment highlighting the fact that the bill before us today will only place an additional burden, an unfair burden, on regional businesses that are doing everything they can to make sure they meet the requirements when it comes to the various requirements under the Local Jobs First program, but there simply isn't the supply of labour or the supply of supplies available to them to meet that at no fault of their own. Acting Speaker, one of the other concerning aspects of this bill is the process by which the Commissioner is required to take into account mitigating circumstances before applying penalties to non-compliance businesses is insufficiently robust. Suppliers will be reliant on a benevolent commissioner to appropriately use their discretion when either applying for a civil penalty order or initiating a deprioritisation process to mark a company down against future tenders. Now, there needs to be much greater clarity in the bill before us today and guardrails around the application of these penalties to suppliers who may be non-compliant due to circumstances, as I've said, Acting Speaker, well outside their control. And as I've said previously, this is not just a matter of a lack of commitment to local industry, but just a case that local subcontractors or apprentices are not always available in all areas at all times to meet these requirements. And it would be deeply, deeply unfair, Acting Speaker, to be penalised in these circumstances, and the bill is insufficiently clear about what are grounds for penalty action for the Commissioner to take. And that's why I am moving a reasoned amendment to this bill on behalf of the Coalition, that this bill not be read a second time. So, Acting Speaker, I move that all words after that be omitted and replaced with the words, "This House refuses to read this bill a second time until the government, 1, addresses the potential financial impact on Victorian businesses, particularly small operators in rural and regional areas, and 2, provides a forecast of the budget impact of the measures contained in this bill," which I will come back to shortly.
We will pause while the reasoned amendment is circulated.
How's that going? Hi, Liam.
We can continue on.
Thank you very much, Acting Speaker. And as I highlighted, the second aspect of the reasoned amendment that I just moved on behalf of the Coalition relates to the appalling lack of transparency from the government in terms of the cost to implement the measures in this bill. Acting Speaker, under questioning from the Coalition members during the bill briefing, departmental and ministerial staff were unable or unwilling to provide any detail around the forecast budget impact of the measures contained in this bill. It stands to reason, Acting Speaker, that increased auditing, compliance and enforcement activities would require greater resources for the Office of the Local Jobs First Commissioner, particularly in terms of headcount. We're talking about expanding powers so that the Local Jobs First Commissioner is able to investigate and inspect sites. So it stands to reason that you would expect that if the government is serious about bringing in this reform, there would be greater resources put behind the Commissioner's office. Now, perhaps this would not be so concerning in normal times, but Victoria's budget is in such a dire state that it is incumbent upon us all in this place to carefully consider the financial impact of any piece of legislation we are asked to pass. Now, Acting Speaker, let me just put some facts on the record. Net debt will reach $194 billion by 28-29 as a result of the past 10 years of financial mismanagement in this state. That equates to an annual interest payment of $10.6 billion, $28.9 million a day in interest repayments, or $1.2 million an hour, Acting Speaker. Now, the opportunity cost of this debt is absolutely staggering. As The Age, in fact, has pointed out, and we've seen today plans for the Allan Labor government to siphon off funds from education, healthcare, public transport into a fund to put forward to fill that black hole to fund their pet project that is the suburban rail loop. But as The Age pointed out, Victoria will spend $36 billion over the next 4 years in interest. That amount could help cover the projected cost of the entire first stage of the suburban rail loop, yet we are paying that in interest repayments. Now, as I said, that is a project the government still hasn't explained how they plan to fund. It has a line item in the budget that literally says TBC, and every year over the forward estimates there's no detail as how it will be funded. But every dollar spent on debt is a dollar that can't be spent on our schools, on our hospitals, on our ambulance service, on housing or on infrastructure. So in this context, given the Labor government's abysmal track record when it comes to managing money, it's entirely reasonable to ask for greater clarity around exactly what the measures in this bill will cost and how it will be paid for. That's why the Coalition's Reason Amendment moves that this House does not consider this bill until the government provides a forecast of the budget impact of the measures contained in this bill. Acting Speaker, I've outlined the Coalition's concerns in relation to the bill before us today. We do not have an issue with the local content requirement when it comes to taxpayer-funded government projects. It's important in terms of local job creation, it's important in terms of encouraging our manufacturing industry, our innovation sector, to make sure that we are looking locally, we are looking here in Victoria, and as I said, as the definition applies to Australia and even New Zealand, for the skills, for the labour, for the supplies on government-funded projects. But what we have seen once again is the government putting forward a bill without the detail as to how it will be implemented. Putting forward a bill that looks to put greater pressure on businesses in regional Victoria in particular that are already doing it tough. We hear time and time again that businesses can't keep up with the pressure the government is putting on them in this state. Whether it is our tax system, looking at the increased number of taxes on our business. We've seen payroll tax continue to increase, the COVID debt levy, the mental health levy, all on our businesses at a time they can least afford it. We now have a situation where we have the government putting in place land tax hikes on our businesses in this state. We have a situation where this government continues to hike up work cover charges on this state. These businesses in regional Victoria can't keep the additional financial pressure coming, and the bill before us today will only increase that pressure. It is a big stick that does nothing to actually ensure that local businesses in regional Victoria have the support of this government. And I say again, Acting Speaker, we cannot keep having bills come into this place and legislation come into this space where we do not understand the budgetary impacts. Victoria's budget is in an appalling state. $194 billion of net debt in the coming years. $1.2 million every single hour will be paid by the Victorian taxpayer in terms of the interest repayment. $50 billion worth of cost blowouts. And yet we have another bill coming in here that does not identify how it will be paid for. How will these additional powers that the Local Jobs First Commissioner be resourced? Will there be an additional headcount? What will be done in terms of site inspections? What greater resources are needed to actually implement this bill? So until we understand the budgetary impacts, it is not acceptable that we are asked to come to the table and support this piece of legislation. The Victorian taxpayer deserves better than a government that continues to disregard the value of their taxes. Before I finish, I want to again reiterate the Coalition's support for the objectives of the Local Jobs First program. It is absolutely worthy that we foster local industry and local job opportunities through government projects. Unfortunately, as I said, Acting Speaker, as with much of the legislation that Labor brings to this place, they have failed to make a compelling argument for why these changes are necessary. They have failed to fully examine and appreciate the potential financial impact to Victorian businesses that this bill could have. They have, as so often they do, neglected to consider the impact on the people and small businesses of regional and rural Victoria. And they have failed, as per usual, to ask the most basic questions about what these measures will cost and how they will be funded. Acting Speaker, Liberals and Nationals will always support sensible reform, and we support the aims of the Local Jobs First program. We understand why we need to incentivise job creation and manufacturing support in this state when it comes to local businesses. But we cannot support a bill that does not answer the basic questions that Victorian industry would expect us to ask.
Member for Box Hill.
Thank you,